Karakia, tā tai tuarangi Māori, whenua Māori, tinana manua henengaro, wairua Māori, rongoa Māori, aho Māori, tūturu o whiti whakamaua kia tīna, home, huie, tae ki e. Episode 3, Part 2, The Indigenious Child. In Part 2, we cover the final two, the mechanics of colonisation, discrimination, confusion, te tiriti versus human rights. Nau mai haramai, kia ora tātou. It seems ironic for the title to be Indigenious Child, seen as Part 2 regards my journey through colonisation and the colonised child I recognise me to be. You know a smattering of my parents' journey and some details of their birth and death dates. You will remember from previous episodes my birth year and the venue. Did I mention I was born in the now closed Cornwall Women's Hospital, Green Lane, Auckland? Well, I was. My umbilical cord was not returned to the whenua to be buried, nor did I have any other pure rituals. I was instead baptised under the Catholic Church and received a name belonging to Mother Mary, the Māori version of it, in the hope the vibrations of the name would protect me and bring me piety. My parents' hope was to give me a really good chance at this life, but to leave it all in the hands of a divine force. In my own mothering experience, I followed suit with no pure ceremony for my son and my placenta, and all its pieces were tossed in the rubbish. And I didn't know anything about taking the placenta back to the whenua in 1985. I had no access to any of that sacred spiritual practice of our culture. I must make a disclaimer here. My tupuna gave up Māori traditions and lifestyle to adopt the English ways. Anthropologists have it well documented in books and other forms of literature. This dates back to the early 1800s up to recent generations of Māori, so it's not something I'm making up as I go along. This isn't a process to label as a disgrace or a thing to be ashamed of. An anthropologist's work that I've read seems to be genuinely aggrieved about that for our sakes. Enthusiasm for the fear of experiencing racism might have been my motivation for abandoning Māori culture. Fights that were all about me defending myself but resulting in me getting broken fingers and black eyes. The beatings I got were a cunning method used to reaffirm the disgust of me and stigma for identifying as a Māori. It is highly advisable to not be in the New Zealand of my informative years. But an aside here. Assimilation, the mystical version, the energy of it comes from above into the person through the crown of the head and travels through the body and anchors into the earth. But the energy only goes so far as the puku because it's circumvented and pulled sideways because of racism and the act of otherizing. You are the other and not like us. So racism in this context is actually good for me in preventing my full assimilation into a Pākehā. My breeding is Māori, but the raising was white European. Today, the educated Māori in me of limited tauranga Māori doesn't agree totally with the anthropologist's theory that my tupuna abandoned or gave up on Māori traditions to adopt white European customs, language and education because they no longer saw any value or use in te reo Māori. I believe there was a show of generosity by my tupuna towards Pākehā integration in those early days of forming our country and te tiriti o Waitangi, to not be a threat to the changes, but the entire surrender of. With what we have been able to learn in the last 50 years of Māori history, the kotahitanga as an example, it doesn't seem to me it was to be a permanency of loss for te ao Māori, but my knowledge is not in-depth enough to say. I can only make a contribution based on my experience of education and raising up Siana in white European New Zealand everything. We had a matriarchal leadership in our household. We had dad, yes and no. Our matriarch mum had given up Māori customs and traditions for European lifestyle values and had taken religion into her heart, as I had said previously, the Catholic religion, which I walked away from at 13 because it was driving me nuts. Well, at least the churchianity was. The priest yelled hellfire and brimstone from the pulpit with a bright red neck face and bald head every Sunday. And on one particular Sunday, where Father White was especially pointing at our heathenness to the congregation and spittle spraying across the divide from him and me, I was sitting in the front row next to Mum, who loved to be seated at the front. So all the families of 8, 10 and 12 children sitting with their mum and dad would be behind us. I gave up on the church that day. I used to marvel at the sight of all those families that weren't like us, and we didn't fit the replication in white Pamua. I remember watching them all walk piously into the church, one after the other, with their mum in the front and dad pulling up at the rear. In case you haven't figured it out by now, my dad was not a religious man. Nope, not at all. Spiritual, but not buying into the sinning, sinful Māori. Though I can't say for sure if either of my parents actually felt pride in being a Māori in their 1930s, 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, New Zealand. Back to me. From the 1960s till my maturity in 2020, I never questioned myself about that very kaupapa. Was I proud to be a Māori? I received Holy Communion at 10 and knew all I could know about the Bible and honoured the Israelites, tupuna, whilst disowning my own. That sounds really odd. When I last said I grew up in the Eurocentric Pākehā world, I really meant that. Before I started school, my life revolved around going to aunties to be babysat whilst Mum went to work at a 9-to-5 factory job, or to be minded by my very elderly grandmother, who suffered from poor health, loneliness, and possibly depression, now that I consider the memories. Nanny had been a mainstay for me in my early childhood, and though Nan had limited English because te reo was her dominant language, at least I remember it that way, and Nan did not teach me te reo. I knew words from repetition, but I don't remember speaking them. I mean, I never said kia ora or ka pai or any of the other greetings or pleasantries of the Māori language. Every word I learned to speak and learn was English and in English. Even if Nan or Mum spoke in te reo Māori, I couldn't respond in kind, and I didn't know the phrases or word structures anyway, and they didn't permit me to speak Māori because no one else in the outside world of shops, kindergarten, businesses and the New Zealand society spoke te reo Māori. There was nothing in my early childhood memories of seeing Māori taonga in our home, and there were no Māori designs or artefacts in our Pākehā European community. We had Te Unga Waka, a Māori culture church in Epsom that would go to once in a while, and there were hui I attended with Nanny. I heard te reo Māori spoken, but it was not something they ever welcomed me into. At kindergarten, I learned to read all in English, and the books about the lambs were a favourite. I believed it belonged to the Golden Book series. My clothing and footwear when I was growing up were all European. I wore nothing that had any Māori emblems or designs. My hair, however, was another matter. That was very fine, wild, and I hated combing it, because it was always full of knots. It was bright red at birth and faded to waka blonde and finally pāwhiro in colours. I didn't control it. Mum cut it so badly and had no style. It was more of grab and slash. It never grew past my neck. Whilst all my other cousins had hair that I envied and was very jealous of. Hair. It's such a big deal once I was in society. Nowadays, when it's not grey, it's red, and I keep it very short. Once I did have long hair, but the cost of keeping it in good condition became a deformity of absurd consumption, i.e., it was expensive. All my education, at primary school was about learning the European standards. I learnt very early on that Captain Cook discovered New Zealand. I belonged to the British Empire and I honoured the Queen and royal family. Maths and science were all European. Reading books on European topics and subjects and fiction such as Cat in the Hat, Winnie the Pooh, The Three Bears, Disney. So as not to bore you all, our lessons were very stock standard for the time, and it emphasised the European and British empirical learning system. College. My social studies lessons included industrialisation, Russia, and their royal family heritage. Geography studies were all about the rest of the world. I don't recall learning about New Zealand. College reading was Shakespeare, the Brontes, Jane Austen, Kill a Mockingbird, all the classics, Rome, Greece, that sort of thing. On a lighter note, my older brother had the Donald Duck comics, which he'd read to me and my older sister and not let us get our sticky hands on them. Yes, I remember us doing the Stick Māori action song in primary school, but other than that, there was nothing else. I can't say what the point of that activity was, but I was not proud of it because everyone laughed at it in a put-downy way. So I did my best not to be associated with or identified as a Māori, but no one, not even me, would admit that. I think at the time, if there was a furthest point to be as far away as possible from this thing Māori, I'd have wanted to be there. I wasn't the only Māori at school and I can't speak for their feelings, but I didn't recall them standing up to Māori culture. To be fair, we were primmers. I wouldn't have expected a 6-year-old to take on the world. But also, I don't know what life other Māori primmers had at home, whether they went home to speak te reo and had customs and traditions Māori. I met any show of Māori culture from Pākehā primary schoolers of my generation with derision. Māori culture was a novelty event, and I'd sooner have kept it that way than to have a black eye for standing up for it when I knew nothing about the traditions of Māori folk songs, their history, who wrote them and why, where they came from, what they meant to the person who wrote them. School was totally devoid of this knowledge. The governing schooling system introduced Māori Club to us at intermediate, and I was all like bravado and hiding a deep sense of shame for being Māori. It carried a huge stigma for me by then, so someone out there must have been fighting for change. My older sister's generation, 6 years ahead of me, never had that opportunity. Their schooling was even more Eurocentric focused, white Eurocentric focused. There was no speaking te reo Māori at school, and we never learnt Māori at primary, intermediate and college, even with the novelty of Māori folk songs and Māori Club. It's important, I think, to add here, keeping to or defying the status quo was choiceless for the colonised child. I mean, good luck to me if I tried to get more Māori out of my mum, her siblings and my schooling. I'd have been flayed and sent to the ethereal edge of the village, though that didn't even exist. The streets did. I learnt the geography of the world from the Eurocentricity, and history was never about New Zealand, never ever about the Treaty of Waitangi. There was no positive reinforcement in me being a Māori pupil at public school. I say it again, I was deeply ashamed to be a Māori by the time I was 13. Everything in the media was white European. The movies I saw were white European, and though we had some Māori media, I remember Pukemanu on TV, it was white European. Other than the Dying Carol show and later the Jeffersons, my diet of white Europeans meant I could watch those shows, but not because they were black actors, but because they were American. This was the mechanics of colonisation operating at a level I had no control over. I almost forgot. We also had a weekly diet of UK working class folk fed to us via Coronation Street. Family viewing. It was very 60s, 70s thing. We looked like the characters in Dress on the Street, and 2 Degrees could have been just like them. All the advertising, billboards, magazines, were all white European themed and focused. And though I chased after these objectives subjectively, I never got close to the heaven on earth they promised. Recently, I was told a Māori is a person who practices their culture, but they are brown skinned. In that same conversation, I was told a Pākehā was first a person with white skin. But I learnt their culture and everything of that as much as was possible to force into a human from my birth to my maturity. So other than my skin colour, I am a Pākehā. Well, that's ludicrous. At least I was fully Pākehā during my schooling years, living in a household that 99% of the time embraced the white European. When I was in my late teens, the fun thing to call us was a potato. I was Pākehā'd, and of course I was a potato, and still am a potato as I decondition and decolonise. We didn't and couldn't, and it didn't exist, the traditional Māori path. I am a colonised human being, person of Māori heritage and descent, struggling to grow up a Māori without the guidance, mentoring or modelling of authentic Māori ethnicity, culture, traditions and love of, within full-on white European training. The vacuum created by this? The old man, my dad, we're disgusted him because of our white European āhua up against his re-emerging Indigenous child. And there was a secret disgust of his Māoriness because they reminded me daily of at least one Pākehā girl who would wait for me after school outside the gates. I was still in primers. This girl was in Standard 4 and reminded me that my parents were animals. My mother raised me to be a good Catholic girl, so I'd never dare retaliate back by telling Ruth her parents were animals too, and I was afraid to retaliate. If I got home with another black eye and bloody nose, I'd be in it for fighting. But the deal was, you never hit a Pākehā because they called the police, and they did. The trouble would land on our doorsteps, even if they provoked the confrontation, which they did. And name-calling, turn the other cheek, like Jesus did, was the teaching. This just gave Ruth the opportunity to carry on. My silence encouraged her. She didn't hit me. Ruth stood a good head and shoulders over me, so her way was to lean down and whisper harshly into my ear. I was 7, she was 11. It doomed me. The love I had for my parents was intense, so I hated Ruth with a sad childhood kind of madness and was crushed because Dad had made decisions to change his lifestyle, and he was angry and bitter. It was a confusing time for all of us. Now back to basics. All the books in our house were white European stories of white European people who did extraordinary things and lived extra lives of luxury, abundance, riches, beauty and intelligence. Mostly that, intelligence and know-how and initiative. And the hair was blonde and beautiful. If there was a struggle, it was not long-lasting and nor intergenerational. The 2 Ronnies, Dick Emery, Monty Python's Flying Circus, on the buses, carry-on movies, doctors in the house, police cars. But this was more early 70s. Mid to late 70s was more American, like $6 Million Man, Charlie's Angels, Angie Dickinson, and the musicals. They were 60s and 70s entertainment, and westerns like The High Chaparral, Bonanza, The Virginian, sci-fi like Star Trek, Doctor Who, and of course Sunday morning radio, and who could forget Disney, Cinderella and Snow White. Yes, I saw those movies. My first album, which I begged my mum for because I had watched it on TV, was Mary Poppins and Chim Chimney Cheroo. Sound of Music. The Flying Nun. What came later was Fast Cars, but still punch-ups, Burt Reynolds and Dukes of Hazzard style. Anyway, I think you get my meaning about programming and conditioning of the colonised child and the mechanics. But to do this, the parents have to be on board as well. Mum worked, and when she wasn't working, she was cleaning the house, gardening, cooking, making bread and sewing clothes. The other big feature in our lives was religion. the church played a significant role for Mum, her whānau, her mother, and the wider Māori community, which my mum interacted with. My grandmother, my mum's mum, played a significant role in naming all her children. Now, my grandmother was not alone in this methodology. I just like to make that clear. All the names of my mum's siblings were from the Bible, and they were the English versions. Naming children after anyone Māori did not receive encouragement or affirmation. Naming meant you'd be giving your children a good chance to get by in this world and succeed in this life, and later when they died, heaven. Discrimination confusion. I married a Pākehā man in 1984, and he is a good person. We divorced in 1992. The only fly in the ointment that I felt during our marriage was from his younger brother, the vibe. Need I say more? My ex-husband's grandmother had found me odd. She had been born in the mid-1800s when there was still authentic Māori, and I was very Europeanised, Pākehāified and potato-eyed. Nevertheless, she was very compassionate and loving, as was my ex-mother-in-law towards me and of me. I left that marriage for a number of reasons that had nothing to do with being ashamed of the connection to them, as I learned more about Te Tiriti o Waitangi and recall my father attributing many of the dysfunctions of Māori society of the time and the demise of directly relating to the dishonouring of this bargain between the Crown and Māori. I am constantly confused about why Māori are placed in the Human Rights Act when we have an agreement that says we are equal in this country. Over the years of my working life and of late my consumptive life in shops and businesses, I have made a number of complaints regarding discrimination on the grounds of my culture, race and colour in Aotearoa, New Zealand. But these complaints have gone through either Human Resources at work or the Human Rights Commission, and both are really daunting and awful. For the most part, I deal with people younger than myself who never knew the New Zealand I grew up in, or they do, but not the finer details of my colonisation experiences I've detailed here. And they can't see the repeat of history as I can, because I lived through it and acknowledge it as a living, breathing part of me still. Just the other day, I chose to watch Sex and the City over homegrown programming, but to offset that, I did choose to watch the Halberg Awards over non-Aotearoa TV programming screening that evening. The re-emergence of Te Reo Māori in the 80s was an assault on my ethics and senses. It offered a mirror to reflect on my life and who I was and wasn't, and the mechanics of colonisation as well as the discrimination confusion were in good working order. So my denial of me and both would mean years of perpetual struggle in the battle for my identification. Decolonisation training became part of my life in spits and spats of clumsy catching and falling, and I hadn't searched as deeply as I do today into my origins of being colonised and the mechanics of that, because I encountered more shame for being something that could simply be dismantled by my examination. And the devil is in the detail of everything, second, minute, hour, day, week, month, and year of my life. And today the discovery of this truth releases me from the mechanics and discrimination confusion. Because everything, and I mean everything, was white European in my ukai-po, no Māori that I knew in my neighbourhood or amongst my school friends was bucking that system, lest you risk being excommunicated. It was a hostile world with no friends in the environment. Conditioning is real, and the trauma when emerging from that conditioning is real too. And the trauma received within the crucible of Europeanisation of this Māori girl is excruciatingly painful. I was no more Māori than the fact that systems determined me to be, but my identity was important. This would define my consumption, employment, gain and contribution till I was spat out by the system as the mechanics of colonisation wore off, or as I've said, as I examined deeply the deep of the Britishization, I discover my way free of the misguided shame and guilt for both myself and my beloved parents. I don't want my work to sound like the eloquent peasant, that individual who is noted in ancient Egyptian history and however he was discriminated against by his own people, whereas this corridor is about something different, but it is still very much the same. And I think of my dad, back to speaking about him, when he inherited his mother's land. His mum died in 1969 and she left all of her land to him. As his efforts began by first untangling the knots of who had sovereignty over the land, he found a huge conundrum. I think he could only feel a deep sense of compassion for his mum, and not to mention the frustrations and bitterness because of what he had to endure in dealing with the corporations who were immensely involved in the land, and they were all in leases for almost eternity. And the whole demeanour of my father changed from that point. And when his dad passed away, because my dad was the eldest son, he inherited his dad's lands as well. So there was a rite of passage for that to happen. It was a rite of blood inheritance. How my father believed it regards Te Tiriti or Waitangi, but that what he found, it was like a knife in the gut to him, twisting inside him, and the harm of Te Tiriti being dishonoured was there. It was traumatising. We needed the treaty to be able to uphold that we can retain sovereignty. Dad discovered he had no sovereignty to make any decisions over the land and decisions he wanted to make about his life. So my dad was not the eloquent peasant, I can tell you that. He didn't wax lyrical as I'm doing in this piece of work to persuade you of the power of my thought and knowledge. Dad protested adamantly and fiercely. He didn't mince words and say nice things to soothe people because a great injustice was happening to him and had been to his parents. Back to Dad, 1980s. He wrote screeds of material regarding the injustices being done to Māori and against their lands, and his protests were not openly received by us. I took part in helping him to write and edit his pamphlets, of course, and then Dad would take them around the country to wherever he went to put the word out that this deceit was happening and the lies being told to him about his lands. You know, I've written arm's lengths of what my schooling was like and what I lived through, so I didn't accept much of what my father was saying or trying to say. In fact, I felt ashamed of him for his dialogues. Before he inherited the lands, he was like everyone else. He'd been called a dirty Māori a lot, and I knew how that felt. It's shocking to hear it for the first time. We didn't grow up with that language in our home, but Pākehā of my childhood and youth, they did. Back to Dad. Nobody in his environment took anything he'd said with interest till it happened to them. Dad, when Waitangi was reactivated, he'd be up there as often as he could on the 6th of February through the 70s and 80s, speaking out about the wrongs and injustices committed by Pākehā-run corporations. And now, here's me writing about the injustices and inequalities that we experience as Māori in this country and the immense racism. And so we know that Tupuna gave up traditions, and we know my grandmother, Mum's mum, named all 11 of her children after saints and personalities from the Bible, like Rebecca, Veronica, Agnes, Margaret, Richard, Romana, Alicia, Amelia, Joseph, Anthony, and their surname was the English version of their Māori name. And this was from 1925. So it's a long time back, but it is close. So we know they made a real effort to be receptive to Pākehā, European, the British, and religion. To and for the Western collective material path, there was a sincere approach made by my grandparents, parents, and their children, offering to meet that, and it was not wanted. It was not to be. The identification of Brown was not accepted, and my education, my upbringing, and everything of value that was Pākehā-centric, and yet I was still not fully accepted. I'm not fully accepted in this country. And I'm left with this awful question. If you didn't want me to be assimilated and you didn't want me to be Māori, well, actually, our past governments wanted us to be assimilated. As I said, that was upended by Pākehā citizens in our communities and neighbourhoods. Still, if you didn't want to become one with us, but wanted the power I held of identification to be up for grabs for the sake of consumption and commodification and the Western collective material path, then what is it that Pākehā, European, New Zealand citizens want? We know what our governments want, but what did and do the Pākehā of my childhood and youth want? What did they want of Māori of the colony when we had done the unforgivable of ourselves by giving away Te Ao Māori for Te Ao Pākehā? I'm left with one answer. Destruction. Destruction of Māori. Destruction of me. I think of my earnest desires to meet the shiny, bright, sparkling Western collective material path. In my parents' generation, it was industrialization. Wow. I didn't enter it as consciously as my parents and grandparents did. My dad's parents named their two sons with fine, upstanding English names with French origins. So it's not something I did by choice. I was choiceless. I look at the situation from the eye of a person who is nothing but a blank canvas. With all that said, when I have everything taken away from me in childhood to make the decisions of my education and environment, the nuts and bolts of it all, and I didn't even know I had valuable nuts and bolts, Māori, yeah, it's a desperate feeling. I'm not writing about the sense of anger, disappointment, grief, outrage at being colonised, and then finding myself in my maturity as a person who is an adult colonised child, recognising my otherness from my culture. What can I do with a strange being? I certainly reflect back now to the many projects in my adulthood that I attempted and the many aspirations, but never succeeded in any of them. Was it to do with being Māori? Was it my skin colour? I certainly worked hard enough and had initiative and desired a true outcome for what I wanted to achieve. I have certificates, diplomas and degrees. Yes, I achieved academia, but not the successes in business, in corporations, in industries of hope and prosperity. I didn't and haven't been able to get that far. If I calculate the journey today and put it one step in front of the other, I would say, yeah, it's fair to say that racial profiling played a big part in my not having access to the Western collective material path and its power structures. I was set up for success. I crossed all the T's and dotted all the I's. I had the Pākehā name. I was Pākehāified and Europeanised. I'd abandoned with my parents and grandparents all things Māori that threatened status quo. My parents didn't do kapahaka. Mum went to church every Sunday and followed the teachings and doctrines as I did, and though they had the reo, they never taught us. My religious foundations were Catholic, and even if I moved away from it, I still believed in God and the good. I should have succeeded in this country, but I did not. I despair. My parents ticked all the boxes so I could have a good chance in this country. With or without being married one time to a Pākehā, I should still have succeeded no matter what. But I didn't. And I get it today that I won't and never will. You know, as I told you before, Mum had stopped all alcohol consumption and cigarettes at 29. She was late getting married, by the by, 27. Most people thought she'd be a spinster. So she gave her children a really good chance at getting on in this world with strong intelligence and hope. But as you know, it was all downhill for me and my morale and esteem from school onwards. Though Mum and Dad did fight for their ancestral lands, and Māori and land are tied up together, their battles were not publicly known like the re-emergence of Te Reo Māori was in the 80s. That threatened many Pākehā citizens. That was public and fair copter whacking from all fronts. Their fight for the lands, on the other hand, was a hidden evil, and land was worth as much in value to Pākehā-run municipalities and corporations and the Crown who had denied so much of us already. The fight for tupuna whenua was my parents' awakening. The process of writing my history is my awakening. And you know, I said in earlier episodes about the gentrification elements that would have been a trigger for those early settlers in the 1800s from Britain to New Zealand. And just an aside here, some history. Whalers. My whakapapa includes a whaler from America. And we know that whalers were at the bottom of the heap in European societies. They were often poor, uneducated, rough, and came from unknown backgrounds. But when they got to the Pacific, rangatira allowed marriages, and one of mine did, and the guy, whaler, hit the jackpot. The guy went from nothing to riches galore. In his life he had 2 fine, beautiful wahine Māori wives, land, food, money, riches, all given by my rangatira. And this was the case for any and all whalers. Do I resent him much, his good fortune? Yes, of course. Of course I do. When I place our journeys side by side, this whaler had full access to this country, more so than I would ever do, and I'm one of his descendants. Makes no difference. By the way, he spent his final years here in Auckland in a convalescent rest home and is buried in a cemetery in the city centre. It's striking, because he was not recognised as one of the people to not be buried with his wives on the land. So in the end, he didn't get that access for the manawa of his koiwi to strengthen the land in death. That's interesting. But back to what I was saying 2 paragraphs ago about gentry. Because in England, the upper class held the lands and they didn't toil in its soils. The rangatira had different roles with similarities, and these were recognised, I'm sure. I recall reading journals from Cook's discoveries and his crew's interactions with Māori, but we were classified as savages, and even the noble savage. But there was a sense of privilege about our earlier history of interactions, that Māori held the privilege of land ownership, and that is something that only gentry in England had the right to. Māori have the privilege of land ownership through ancestral rights, and it's passed to the eldest son. Sound familiar? That highborn married their daughters into good marriages for all the right reasons, and this is so familiar too to those earlier settlers, travellers and whalers alike. It must have smarted against their sensibilities that savages owned lands and had privileges. When you come from a country that is mono, and history tells us the British kept all their slaves in the Caribbean away from prying eyes till the Windrush generation in the 1960s entered the UK. But that was nearly 180 years after Cook had made first contact. Till then the UK was pretty monocultured, with just white European people. The early settlers' experiences of first setting eyes on Māori have been documented, and the photo of the dusky maiden was highly commodified for the consumption of Western males in the UK and Europe of the 1800s. And Māori's first engagement with Pākehā is well documented too, and though both found each other the way they did as a result of their cultures and lenses, the British who owned slaves would not have been unfamiliar with us, as our skin colouring was not white. The point I make here is they had the jump on us because they knew about brown and black-skinned people. Even the very poor and those convicts sent to New Zealand and Australia would have known and seen images of black and brown-skinned people. They had some knowledge of people who were non-white, so I don't understand the resistance, reluctance, the disgust, the stigmatising of Māori by Pākehā settlers and later Pākehā citizens of the New Zealand I grew up in. In recent years, I've been dealing with a different kind of racism and racist from a deeply monoculture, but they're the same and yet with an edge more vicious, which has blindsided me. I'm now being racially profiled in shops and businesses owned by Asians, Chinese, Indian, and I've experienced provocative covert racism by people from Eastern countries. I get into an Uber or a blue bubble taxi and I experience new haters of Māori, calling us this and that and evil and criminals and committing all the crime and we don't work and on and on. And doesn't this all sound so familiar to me from my childhood? Today I don't use either Uber or blue bubble taxis. The other places I've been racially profiled have been in Countdown, New World and Pack and Save supermarkets and big brand stores. And to all of them, yes, I have made complaints through official lines. I used to bother with Google Feedback, Reddit in the early days, and Trustpilot, but these never scratched the surface of the issue for me, that these are my new colonizers. I found racism in some Google feedback about insufferable beggars and street people outside Victoria Street Countdown supermarket who predominantly happen to be Māori. And I won't bore your intelligence about Reddit and how so many Redditors of Asian descent found the Auckland CBD to be very dangerous with Māori. These sentiments harken back to my childhood and youth. When I met with Countdown management to discuss my complaint of racial profiling, they assured me they were intending to have hired Māori and Pacifica Wahine management, and this is from a dominant Asian Indian organisation, at least at shop ownership levels. It doesn't impress me. This is people of a different culture and race able to come into New Zealand and have that privilege over Māori to hire us and decide our fates and successes. I don't think I'll be watching that space, as the racial profiling never ends as new staff enter the shop who are new to New Zealand, and I faced racism exactly like that from my youth, the same hostile attitudes and disgust and stigmatisation. What I find distressing for all the right reasons, upon my approach to these supermarkets, big brand stores, municipals and banks to address the racial profiling, I find they all use the same customer service training program with the defence of, I'm sorry it made you feel that way, i.e. the behaviour of the staff. So I decide or question, I'm not being discriminated against, I'm being emotional. These organisations can have all these lofty ideals, and you know we've been on that journey in this podcast about lofty ideals. They don't reach the ordinary citizens. I just don't know what the answers are. Yes, times have changed, and this descent of Māori from land holdings to now homelessness astounds me. It knocks the breath from me with such a force. I have to lie down. That I continue to hold on to my tūpuna whenua is not a privilege over Māori that don't have tūpuna whenua and don't know their pēpeha whakapapa, and their assimilation is gigantic. Assimilation in human terms is such a highly charged, ruthless ending to everything natural. The concerns of polarisation in our race and culture becomes a new concern for me. I am worried about Māori that have and Māori that don't. I appreciate the efforts being made to bring about an equal field of endeavour for all Māori by Māori. Through my efforts to have an education in my maturity, I know what it's like to make sacrifices as a poor student who becomes homeless to live in a car, to be hungry and starve so I can achieve my academic goals, and find myself today unemployable because of ageism. So the true adage is you can't run and you can't hide from the white Eurocentric ambitions, cause it'll get you, if not now, eventually, as it has for me in the most important of all Western collective power structures, my choice of employment, and to hold on to that for the truth. So I have the next best option today, to write. And as for the new colonisers who are haters of Māori and the racial profiling I experience today in all my history is repeating itself. My closing thoughts surround what kind of society we want to raise our children and grandchildren in Aotearoa. When I look at what our past governments created with the power of their white male patriarchy, and I'm only one of so many like myself who are creations out of these terms of government, I'm left with what I have contributed here in this episode of The Indigenious Child, Colonised. Thank you for joining me for this kōrero. Please stay safe and stay close for episode 4, Assimilation. Ka kite anō.